I'm Simon. For the folks I haven't met before, g'day. I'm Australian, so I'm going to try and work through the accent. So I've had the opportunity to be a Kafka consultant for the last 10 years or so. I've had most of my time through a company called ThoughtWorks, and this has given me an opportunity to work with about 30 enterprise-sized clients. Typically, we're talking banks, airlines, healthcare, utility companies. So today, I just wanted to share essentially the greatest hits, or essentially 10 minutes, can I share back some of those pain and learning with the folks in the room, just some lessons I've learned in the field. And like any great song album, this one comes with a parental warning. I have to say, there's some spicy opinions ahead. Alrighty, so I'm going to start way back in 2014, and the advice there is probably as relevant as it was a decade ago as it is now, and that is, have to understand that the Apache Kafka ecosystem has a large footprint, so it's important to stay happy by staying relevant. Now, one of the things I've learned by working alongside clients, mid-sized clients, large-sized clients, is you've got to appreciate that there's going to be a bit of a blocker and a stumbling block for folks and definitely developers and project teams to get up to speed quickly learning Apache Kafka. So I've got a couple of bits of advice. One of the best things I've learned working with mid-sized clients is you can really benefit by having a wonderful onboarding experience. And the easiest way of getting a great onboarding experience and a low intimidation onboarding experience for developers is simply providing them a sandbox environment. And I mean a sandbox environment that's even prior to development, just so folks can get up and running easily. And when I say a really accessible sandbox environment, I mean one that they can just use without filling out a JIRA ticket or a form. It's a great way to get folks up and running and familiar with Kafka quickly. For another sort of bit of advice here around learning and staying current, I think we have to appreciate that the Apache Kafka ecosystem is quite broad. We are talking everything from connect to network topologies to distributed computing. And because that landscape keeps growing, it's important to stay relevant. And one of the things that I find really great is to come to conferences like this, learn and share from others, and also being tuned into some of the online resources. This is one of those meta resources that I really think is great, but equally, just staying happy means keeping current and familiar with the technology. One thing I've also learned, and maybe this came up a few years ago, back in 2015, was I started working across clients that started to have essentially some of the same smells and patterns when I talked about problems in the field. Now, you don't need to work for a large Kafka company to actually appreciate some of these lessons, but I think any mature Kafka shop essentially falls into these sort of same rhythms and same learnings. And that's really, there's many knobs to turn in Apache Kafka. So one of the best bits of advice I could give is it's really important to sort of codify the principles that you want into some predefined approaches for common tasks. Now, I know that's really wordy, so what I actually mean by that is you really want to get to a place where you're hiding a lot of the complexity from most of the development staff, and this actually means just wrapping the producer and consumer SDK into some frameworks and some language choices so you can actually hide and facade away a lot of the complexity just so folks can get up and running quickly. And that actually hides a lot of the Kafka boilerplate. And there's two reasons for that. Firstly, you don't want people to muck around with tools that they don't need to worry about, such as partitioning strategies if it's not their day job. But it also allows you to hide things behind the scenes. So hiding the Kafka boilerplate, wrapping the SDK, and essentially making sure that folks who don't need to worry about serialization and key strategies and other properties, you hide that away, hide that behind a facade, or at least default it. It makes life much easier. And it also allows you, as a platform owner, allows you to change some of these things after the fact. So some of those lessons really come back to remaining happy. So I think I'm amongst friends here, so at this point I'd like to apologize because sometimes in my past I have made some mistakes. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I once heard it said that Kafka is flexible enough to solve just about any problem. Now, there's a bit of a flip side to that statement, which is that Kafka is flexible enough to solve any problem, which means naturally that there's some situations where you're falling into conversations with clients, and you have to think to yourself, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. And the same is true with Apache Kafka. Not everything should be an Apache Kafka project. So what are some of the smells and symptoms and signals that sort of indicate that maybe you're putting engineering effort into the wrong solution? And I'd kind of just come up with a few sort of pick lists here. I've had projects that are essentially disasters at the end of the day because they had characteristics. Unreliable networks. If you're doing anything in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of a mine site, you're wearing a jacket and you're 1,000 kilometers away from a city, they might be indicators that you're working with unreliable networks. And those are kind of like the patterns where you actually don't want to be considering a distributed Apache Kafka network. Another reason that you might not want to use Kafka is if you're dealing with thousands of simultaneous either brokers or consumers acting as client applications. Again, that's kind of a smell that you should be rethinking your architecture. If your goal is to ship really large payloads or your intent is to replace a database, again, that's probably a signal that you shouldn't be using Kafka. And the last one is one that actually comes up quite a bit. If your goal is to do something cool, if you're working with a client who just wants to essentially have something on their CV or their resume, resume-driven development, again, is a symptom of maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Back a few years ago, I got really excited by the power of schemas. And this is much more relevant when you're talking about huge multinational and enterprise-sized clients. But schemas are cool, but managing them can be difficult because we're talking about, well, how do you deal with moving from monolithic to decomposed microservices? And you have to understand that schemas serve a really, really important purpose of essentially acting as an interface, a translation guide between publishers and subscribers that need to agree on how a message is formatted. Now, that's technically true, but there's a lot of sort of management stuff around schemas that often gets overlooked. So people think the beginning of the job is to stand up a schema registry, and that's necessary but not sufficient. I think schema management is one of those things that's really underappreciated. So the shortcut here is that your schema management should look like your code management. You need some sort of configuration profile, and it's typically something that looks like managing your schemas much like you manage code, much like a code repo. Equally, you want to have some sense around who is managing the schemas. A general approach is that you want your project teams and your developer teams to be empowered to introduce change, and you want your platform team or your downstream consumer team to be accepting those PRs against the schemas. Schema flexibility, you really want to encourage that. You actually want to encourage evolvability because you do actually want to introduce change. And then there needs to be essentially a shared conversation around maybe not the right, but an appropriate compatibility mode. And that, to me, are the lessons for how to love schemas. And essentially one of the other things that sort of came up quite recently is working with centralized Kafka. And that is when large enterprises start thinking about how to move all of their disparate Kafka clusters together and start thinking about Kafka as a central platform. Now, it goes without saying, introducing Apache Kafka to an enterprise, think a large bank or a large financial services company, is not without its challenges. So there's ultimately got to be a way to balance the need of developers and platform teams. So how do you go about that? Ultimately, I think there's a bit of a balancing act. You really want to establish appropriate abstractions, making sure that the project teams, the development teams have the tools that they need. But you can also talk about what is absolutely the minimum bar, the non-negotiables when it comes to platform concerns and enterprise concerns. So that's typically things like security, access, and auditing, and making sure that the platform supports that. Enforcing best practices by default. Things like serialization, monitoring, and encryption, those are important to bake in from day one. So the platform team should actually make sure that that is part of the frameworks, and it's never going to work if you're asking your development team to backpropagate those code changes after the fact. So essentially, those are the ways to balance the needs of the developers and the platform concerns. And the last kind of theming that I'd like to leave here is essentially running Kafka yourself can be pretty time consuming depending on how big you scale. So one way of saving your tears is to come up with a really, really basic bit of advice here is that no one should be running Apache Kafka yourself. You should be generally using a SaaS provider. I'm sure if you went downstairs to the vendor hall, you'd find many people whose day job it is to run Apache Kafka. Now, I've got a little bit of an asterisk there, so I don't think anyone should be running Apache Kafka themselves unless you're an extremely small company or an extremely large company. And I think the 80% of companies in the middle should be just using a SaaS provider. Alrighty, so we've covered a lot of territory in 10 minutes, so I just wanted to summarize this. Codify best practices, wrap your SDKs, love schemas, manage them like code, balance the needs of the platform developers and the project concerns, and ultimately, keep learning. And with that, I want to say it's fantastic to wrap up the last 10 years, and I'm hoping to come back in 10 years and discuss the next beautiful things that have been built together. Thanks very much for your time.